Well, I think we should be really cautious when we look abroad and hear these kind of appalling things that are happening across Europe and the rest of the world, and really take stock of how these things can come to pass. I mean, if you'd said 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic that we'd be considering mandatory vaccines for certain staff members, for care home workers, I don't know if we would have believed you, because in the UK we've always had a very high rate of trust in vaccination, and sort of voluntary policies which have always seen us in really good stead. But it's a really stark warning to us of the road we can go down if we embrace these kind of policies of medical segregation, essentially. In times of crisis, civil liberties and rights do tend to slide. And so it's so important that we really draw a red line under this idea of medical segregation and don't pursue it in any context. COVID passes are a form of medical segregation, shutting out people who've made a personal choice about vaccination from jobs and from areas of public life.
Yeah.
And we need to start at the beginning, otherwise it inevitably will expand, and we could see a situation like Austria happening here in the UK.
Well, I suppose that's the concern, isn't it? It's the slow, creeping, asphyxiating hand of the state into all of our lives. What I will say, though, about the care home jabs and the NHS staff jabs, I'm just going to call them mandatory vaccinations because that's what they are. Because in my book, if you have to have a job, otherwise you lose your... Sorry, if you have to have a jab, otherwise you'll lose your job, that's a mandatory vaccination as far as I'm concerned, right? So let's call them mandatory jabs. However, whenever I talk about them, which is fairly often, I usually get a flurry of emails in from people making, in my opinion, it might not be the point I agree with, but a perfectly justified point, which is, would you want your elderly relative in hospital being treated by someone who was unvaccinated? Would you want an elderly person in a care home being treated by someone who was unvaccinated? And I do think, I know I've banged on a bit about polling data there, that is probably one poll I can believe, which is that most people would want care workers and NHS workers to be jabbed. So in that case, is that an overreach of government power?
Well, I think that that's understandable, and I think there is actually really, really high vaccine uptake across the NHS and across care home workers. The majority of care home workers are vaccinated and have worked so hard to look after our loved ones. But I think we actually have to listen to what the unions and what care homes and medical unions are saying themselves, that because these industries work on such tight, incredibly tight margins with their staff, actually it's far more dangerous to impose these kind of mandates, because even the loss of a few members of staff can put elderly relatives or vulnerable people in hospital in a much more dangerous position. So actually, it could really backfire, and we've already seen that happening in care homes across the country. Of course, the mandate came in just a few days ago, and care homes are really struggling because the loss of just a few staff members can have a devastating impact on the quality of care. And so it's already starting to backfire now. The government has sort of, I think, accepted this to some degree because they've pushed back the NHS mandate to later on. So if we look at, what good care looks like in the NHS and in care homes, it looks like having as many staff as possible, really. And forcing these people who've worked so incredibly hard to keep our loved ones safe and keep us safe over the last 2 years. We've gone from clapping carers to sacking carers, and it's really unconscionable that we're kind of asking these people to make this choice between their own medical freedom and bodily autonomy and a job.
Yeah, what do you make as well about, I know at Big Brother Watch you talk a lot about just literal civil liberties, as it were, but what about the kind of almost mental health civil liberties that we have in this country? We have, as it stands, a health minister who is currently still holding Christmas to ransom, right? He's basically holding a big sword of COVID Damocles over whether or not you can carve a turkey next to your nan on December the 25th. Is this right? Is Christmas Day the preserve of a health minister?
I think this kind of coercive, threatening approach to public health is so damaging. It's damaging for public trust in terms of the COVID response, because if you feel like you're being pushed into things all the time, I think that does naturally make people feel a bit suspicious about things. So it's hugely damaging, for our kind of mental health, but also for actual public engagement in health measures. And this could have implications not just for the COVID response, but for long-term trust in the NHS, in public health measures, in vaccination in general. We've always had, really high levels of trust in public health in this country. We've had this fantastic vaccine uptake and really strong adherence to kind of social distancing, those kind of things, without this kind of constant threatening all the time. And so to reverse this policy now is really dangerous for vaccine uptake in general and for booster uptake. So I think it could really seriously backfire and push people away from taking public health interventions that are actually helpful and useful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Actually, it's a question of kind of the medic that cried wolf, isn't it? You know, how many times are we going to have to hear these threats and hear these threats? How many times are we going to have to feel as though we've been coerced before potentially some people just decide, actually, I'm not engaging with this anymore. And then the time that you really need to, then you decide that that's when you're not going to do it, and that's a devastating situation. But Madeleine, thank you very much, Madeleine Stone there of Big Brother Watch.